geography of the Gospels. We'll first talk about the events that led to the rule of Herod the Great. Alexander Jannaeus died in 76 BCE, and he left his kingdom in the hands of Alexandra Salome, his wife. Alexandra had designated her succession to their son John Hyrcanus II, but while she was still ailing, Judah Aristobulus II rebelled and usurped the throne from his older brother. And as Josephus tells us, the younger brother proved to be a more energetic leader. It seems that Aristobulus was allied to the Sadducean aristocracy, who had suffered under Alexandra's policy of appeasement towards their rival Pharisees. The death of Salome brought about open conflict between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. The brothers agreed to a cessation of hostilities. Hyrcanus even agreed to relinquish his claims to the high priesthood and throne. Into this fraternal struggle, Josephus introduces the father of the future King Herod, Antipater, who was Idumean. Alexander Jannaeus had appointed the father of Antipater to the strategos of all Idumea, and his son Herod succeeded him in the same position. He appealed to King Aretas for support to help Hyrcanus regain his position. Aretas was promised that he would regain possession of cities taken by Alexander Jannaeus: Medeba, Libba, Dabalat, Delalat, Arabatha, Agala, and 5 others. During Passover of 65 BCE, the Nabatean forces besieged Jerusalem, where Aristobulus had withdrawn to the Temple Mount. The Sadducean priests, who feared Hyrcanus would revive the anti-Sadducean policies of his mother, defended Aristobulus. Pompey was concluding his campaign in Armenia and sent Marcus Aemilius Scaurus with Roman legions to Syria. Both brothers made an appeal to him with a promise for bribes and support from the Romans. Pompey spent the winter of 64-63 BCE in Syria, where he received delegations from Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Pompey feared the rash nature of Aristobulus, and it was proved right when Aristobulus disobeyed the order of Pompey and had to be tracked down. After some difficulty in Jerusalem, the Romans reinstalled Hyrcanus as high priest. He was also designated ethnarch of the Jewish people. Aristobulus and his family were led off to Rome in chains, but his son Alexander escaped and caused a lot of trouble. Jewish settlements were divided into 2 parts: Judea, with Idumea and Perea in the south, and Galilee in the north. They were separated by the hostile region of Samaria, Greek cities and townships, and the loss of Esdraelon, the Jezreel Valley. Jerusalem was relegated to a Roman tributary city from which Hyrcanus was given oversight of affairs in Judea. When Aristobulus escaped from captivity in Rome with his younger son, Antigonus, he tried to resist Roman rule in Judea. After a defeat, he retreated to Machaerus, the Hasmonean fortress east of the Dead Sea. They held out for 2 days, after which Aristobulus was returned to Rome. In 40 BCE, Parthian forces invaded Syria to challenge Rome's eastern frontier. Herod fought the Parthians and other enemies until 37 BCE. He was successful and brought to an end the Hasmonean dynasty. Antigonus was led away in chains to Antioch. In the first case on record, Rome beheaded a conquered king. Now let's talk about the rule of Herod. It took Herod almost 3 years to gain the kingdom granted to him by the Roman Senate. After the capture of Jerusalem in 37 BCE, he ruled for 34 years. His reign can easily be divided into 3 periods. During the first 12 years, 37 to 24 BCE, he consolidated power. The second period, 25 to 13 BCE, was a time of great prosperity. His relationship with Rome was positive. He accomplished most of his great building projects. Some of his projects consisted of Jericho, Masada, Caesarea, Sebaste or Samaria, the Herodium, and Jerusalem. The final years, 13 to 4 BCE, were marked by domestic strife and his declining health. During this time, he killed many of his own family, including his wife, Mariamne, his mother-in-law, Alexandra, his sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, and 5 days before his own death, his eldest son, Antipater. Now the birth of Jesus. Matthew and Luke deal with the details concerning the birth of Jesus. Mark and John both begin with John's ministry. Matthew and Luke identify the place of Jesus' birth at Bethlehem, but they do so from different historical perspectives. Matthew emphasized the relationship between Jesus and David. John, on the other hand, lacks both the title Son of David and any mention of a Bethlehem birth. Luke records that Joseph and Mary lived in Nazareth and went to Bethlehem as a result of a decree ordered by Caesar Augustus when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Luke also reports on the appearance of angels in the heavens and the shepherds who reported their experience with the angels. Joseph's enrollment at Bethlehem suggests that he originated from the Judean region south of Jerusalem. We are not told why Joseph was living in Nazareth before he went to Bethlehem. Nazareth was a very small village of priests, and it was a remote, insignificant village. Both Matthew and Luke put Jesus' birth in the last years of Herod the Great. This was a time when Herod was very concerned with his throne and who might try to move in as his successor. The massacre of children in Bethlehem is reported by Matthew. There is no other support for this story, but knowing the character of Herod, it fits in well with his other actions. Joseph was warned before this event to flee to Egypt, and his family stayed there until after the death of Herod. Archaeol, Herod's son, was ruling in Judea, so Joseph took his family to live in Nazareth. Notley is careful to give a good interpretation of the Matthew phrase, "He, Jesus, will be called a Nazarene." It should be taken with Isaiah 42:6, which says, "I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the nations." This emphasis is not on Nazareth, but on the safekeeping of Jesus until the time is right for him to be revealed. Lower Galilee has several valleys that facilitate travel. Upper Galilee lacks these. The east-west valleys are Beth Akerim, Hanathon, Beit Netophah, and Turan. There was more outside contact with Lower Galilee, and it was there that now urban centers developed. Jesus often traveled from his home in Nazareth to Capernaum. He seems to have taken the Ptolemais Tyriki trunk road from his boyhood home to the Sea of Galilee. The text mentions Jesus in Cana several times. In fact, his first miracle was performed one day in Cana. It was probably a way station on his route to the Sea of Galilee. From Nazareth to Capernaum is almost 30 miles, too long a journey for one day. Cana was a little more than 7 miles north of Nazareth and had easy access to the sea region of Galilee. The site of Cana should be identified with Kerbet Kana in the Beit Netophah Valley. One of Jesus' disciples, Nathanael, was from Cana. Now, what about the first century environs of the Sea of Galilee? Events in the ministry of Jesus outside of Jerusalem are primarily located in the region around the Sea of Galilee, especially in the north and northwest area of the lake. Tiberias was a new city founded by Herod Antipas. Unfortunately, he was not careful where he put it. Jesus never visited the site. It was built on an old cemetery. At the foot of Mount Arbel cliffs on the road from Tiberias along the lakeshore was Magdala. Magdala comes from a term that means fish tower. Another name for the city is Tariki, which means salted fish. You can see that fishing was the dominant industry in the city in the first century. Jesus embarked on a fishing boat from Gennesaret, and he would have come near to the Tower of Magdala. Magdala was the home of Mary Magdalene. She followed Jesus from Galilee and was with those who discovered Jesus' empty tomb. The most frequently mentioned city is Capernaum. After his rejection in Nazareth, Jesus moved to Capernaum, and this became his home. Peter also had a home there, and a church is built over the traditional site. There is also a synagogue in Capernaum dating to the 4th or 5th century. It is built on an early Galilean style and is the largest synagogue discovered in Israel. The archaeological evidence at the site points to the coexistence of the Jews and Christians. Below the synagogue that is now evident, there are two other synagogues which date from a much earlier period. Of the three Galilean cities, Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida, that Jesus mentions in places in which he performed miracles, only Chorazin is not located on the Sea of Galilee. It is about 2 miles north of Capernaum. Archaeological evidence indicates that the town suffered a devastating earthquake in the early 4th century, but was rebuilt. In Chorazin, they found the seat of Moses. Jesus stood to read the scripture, and then he sat down to teach. And this would have been on the seat of Moses. Bethsaida is frequently mentioned. According to the tradition of the fourth gospel, it was the home of Philip, Andrew, and Peter. The site of Bethsaida is still debated. There are two places. One site is El Arak, and the other is Et Tel. What we do know of this site, it was a fishing village transformed by Herod Philip into a Greco-Roman polis and renamed Julius. Philip increased the population and strengthened the fortifications of the city. Bethsaida contained both Gentile and Jewish populations. It was accessible by boat. The city lay on the Sea of Galilee. It was about 660 feet from the Jordan River. It was in Lower Gaulonitis, opposite the higher hill country, and the area nearby included a marshy plain. Notley has given several reasons why Et Tel does not fit the evidence pointing to Bethsaida. Its geographical position is 1.8 miles from the lake. The physical height of the mount is too high for the surrounding lake level. It is 22 feet high. If the lake were high enough to give it a regular shoreline, the lake would have inundated the shoreline of Capernaum, the ports of Tiberias and Cursi, and every other known first-century settlement around the lake. Another problem is the total lack of evidence of the early Roman, that is the New Testament period. And there seemed to be no evidence for a Roman temple at the site. Now, about the problem of Gadarasa and Gadara. Jesus' encounter with the demoniac appears in all the Gospels. There is a topographical problem with the names used. Gadara, the capital of the toparchy, was about 6 miles southeast of the Sea of Galilee. Gerasa was about 33 miles. Origen recognized the problem of Gadarasa and Gadara. He suggested Gergasa, an ancient city by the lake now called Tiberias, by which is a cliff overhanging the lake, from which they show that the swine were cast down by the devils. For the purpose of our study, what is important is the familiarity of both Eusebius and Jewish Midrash with the location of Girgash, Girgashta, Gerushta, Gergasa on the southern side of the Sea of Galilee. On the basis of topography, the region surrounding the ancient village of Gergasa, El Kurtzi, better fits the details presented by the evangelists. Only in the vicinity of Gergesa do the slopes of the height descend steeply to the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Its location fits Matthew and Mark's description of Jesus' destination on the other side, and Luke's opposite Galilee. Now we'll talk about the last days of Jesus. From Galilee, Jesus approached Jerusalem in the days leading up to Passover. His travel through Jericho indicates he took the road through the region of Perea and the Transjordan, passing through the territory of Scythopolis. Jesus used several ways to travel from Galilee to Jerusalem. We are familiar with his travel through Samaria, but sometimes that route had to be avoided. This was a watershed route. It was more direct and took only 3 days. But because of the violence between the Jews and Samaritans, it was sometimes considered too dangerous. A third route from Galilee, mentioned in the ancient sources, is along the foothills of Mount Ephraim to Antipatris and ascended the Beth Horon Ridge to Jerusalem. From Jericho, Jesus made his way to Jerusalem. The Passover had to be eaten inside the city, and the disciples' effort to arrange the meal is a clear indication that Jesus followed the rabbinical stipulations regarding the Passover meal. But because of the number of pilgrims, Jesus stayed in Bethany, perhaps in the home of Mary and Martha, but there is no direct evidence other than their prior friendship for this. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. There is no indication where the Passover meal was eaten, other than the fact it was within the city of Jerusalem. Mark says it was a room upstairs. Christian tradition locates this room on the southern slopes of the western hill of Jerusalem, but there is no evidence for this. After the meal, hymns of praise were sung, probably the Hallel of Psalm 113 to 118. Then Jesus and his disciples went to the Mount of Olives. Matthew and Mark say the place was called Gethsemane. Because of the restrictions on travel for the Sabbath, they were unable to return to Bethany that night. Judas came with a group of temple personnel to arrest Jesus, whose group needed to be distinguished from other groups that were camping in the vicinity. Judas did this with a kiss. Then all the disciples fled. Jesus was arrested and taken to the house of Caiaphas, which was located on the southern portion of the western hill, though other places are possible. The priests were criticized for their oppression, secrecy, and financial misconduct. At daybreak, Jesus was brought to the Sanhedrin. Luke's term to indicate a council chamber seems to be less than the full Sanhedrin in Jesus' condemnation and transfer to the Romans. Typically, the Sanhedrin was against putting anyone to death. A quote from a Jewish writing says, "A Sanhedrin that puts someone to death in a week, that is a 7-year, is called destructive." Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, even one person in 70 years. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva says, if we had been members of the Sanhedrin, no one would ever have been put to death. According to Steve Notley, In addition, the understanding that only the clans of Annas, that is, Annas, Caiaphas, John, and Alexander, and you compare this with Acts 4:6, and those close to them were present in the chamber of stone and questioned Jesus. This is more fitting with the subsequent steps taken by Jesus' accusers. Their actions would hardly have gained the required approval of the full Sanhedrin. To deliver a fellow Jew into the hands of the Romans with the possibility of his execution was considered in Jewish opinion a transgression of such magnitude that it was eternally unforgivable. Jesus was taken to Pontius Pilate and accused of political sedition. Pilate was in the Praetorium at the palace of Herod the Great on the western hill. Both Philo and Josephus report that Herod's palace in Jerusalem was the residence of the Roman governor. When Pilate learned that Jesus came from Galilee, he tried to pass Jesus on to Herod Antipas, tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, who was staying in the former Hasmonean palace. Jesus would not answer Herod, so he was sent back to Pilate in a purple robe. Pilate attempted to punish Jesus and release him. The priestly family pressed for his execution. Condemned, Jesus is led outside the city to be crucified. Avigad concluded that he had discovered the remains from the Ginat Gate, the only gate that led from the city of Jerusalem through that wall that is mentioned by Josephus. It was the location of a limestone quarry during the Old Testament period. The traditional tomb of Jesus has been severely damaged over the centuries. The best evidence is that the traditional site of Golgotha was outside the walls of the first century Jerusalem. The site remains the best candidate for the place of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And now for the resurrection. Jesus arose from the grave as reported by the Gospels and Paul. Though there seemed to be insufficient time to prepare the body for burial, Nicodemus and Joseph used spices and wrapped the body in linen. It seems that the women were prepared to perform the actual ritual for burial after the Sabbath. The stone had been rolled away, but no body was found. Jesus identified himself to Mary Magdalene, who reported it to the apostles. The apostles attest to several appearances. These include Cephas, the 12, more than 500 at the same time, and then to Paul himself. Special attention is given to two men on their way to Emmaus. They were in conversation when Jesus joined them. He explained to them how the scripture spoke of him, but they did not recognize him until he broke bread with them at the table. Then they hurried back to Jerusalem to tell the others. We must locate Emmaus. One place mentioned is Nicopolis Emwas, but this is too far from Jerusalem. Luke says it was 60 stadia, 7 miles from Jerusalem. Nicopolis Emwas exceeds that distance, it being approximately 22 miles from Jerusalem. Josephus knew of another Emmaus closer to Jerusalem, which was a distance of 30 stadia. Perhaps Luke's measurement included the return distance to Jerusalem, for the text says they went back to Jerusalem that same night. After the resurrection, before Jesus ascended to heaven, he promised he would send another to take his place, one who would continue what he had begun. 50 days after Passover, the Jews celebrate Pentecost. Jews from all over the world come to Jerusalem for this event. The Holy Spirit fell on the Christians gathered for prayer. The noise expressed by these Christians attracted many who were in the temple. They all heard God being praised in their own language, but those speaking were from Galilee. Peter explained to them what was going on and preached a sermon to them, which led to the conversion of 300 people. They were then baptized. Notley points out that recent excavations near the southern entrance to the Temple Mount unearthed numerous MIQUVOT, that is, ritual immersion baths. Many more were likely destroyed as a result of construction during the Byzantine and subsequent periods. These may have been used for the baptisms. When Jesus spoke about the Spirit coming on them, he also said, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." Acts 1:8. This gives us the outline followed by Luke in writing the book of Acts. When these Jews returned to their homes, they shared the gospel they had received. This spread the message and prepared the way for the eventual ministry of Paul throughout the Roman Empire.